The first argument that libertarians should not make comes in under the general category of preaching to the converted. It is always very tempting to give the kind of speech which is about how you and people who agree with you, which is who is in the audience, are good guys, and you're smart, and the people who disagree with you are bad guys and they're stupid. And it convinces nobody who doesn't already agree with you. And worse still, it makes your audience less able to convince other people, because somebody who is sure that his views are obviously right and other people's views are obviously wrong is not going to be very persuasive in actually talking to the other people. Probably won't even understand what their views are. So what I try to do with my talks is to make the talk either something the audience doesn't already know or something the audience disagrees with. And this hopefully is in the latter category, but we will see. I've got a list of things which I'm going to run through, of arguments libertarians shouldn't make. The non-aggression postulate is the first one, the claim that you can reach your conclusions by the assumption that nobody should ever initiate coercion. The second one is the idea that property rights are easy, that it's easy to describe what the proper legal system ought to be. The third one is the idea that laissez-faire solves everything, that there are no problems if only the government would get out of the way. The fourth one is the claim that climate change either isn't happening or isn't our fault. The fifth one, for a subset of libertarians who agree with me, is the claim that anarchy is always the right answer, that an anarchist society can never not work, essentially, or at least a proper anarcho-capitalist society can never not work. And for each of these, I hope to be able to offer you alternative arguments that you can make that are defensible, unlike the ones that you shouldn't make. And let me start with the non-aggression postulate, which is popular with libertarians. And my favorite argument against it is due to the late Bill Bradford, who was the editor of Liberty magazine for a long time. And it is, you happen to fall off the balcony of your 9th floor apartment. Perhaps you've been drinking some of ASI's fine wine, or for some other reason you got careless. But by good luck, the flagpole of the 8th floor apartment just below you is strong enough so when you catch it on your way down, it supports you. And you're working your way hand over hand to the balcony of the 8th floor apartment to get off, at which point the owner of the 8th floor apartment and the flagpole comes out and tells you that you do not have his permission to use his flagpole. Do you initiate coercion? Or do you let go? There may somewhere be a libertarian who believes that he would let go. There might even be one who would let go, but I wouldn't count on it. Another example of the basic point I'm making is that the non-aggression postulate is too strong, that it is put as whatever the reason, you should never do X. And if you think up strong enough reasons, it's not believable. So my second example, which is actually mine rather than Bill Bradford's, is that a madman is shooting a bunch of people. It's a mass shooting. Conveniently, there is a rifle within your reach. Inconveniently, it belongs to somebody who has frequently said that he doesn't want anybody else to ever use his rifle. Do you grab it and save a dozen lives, or do you respect his property rights? The other one that I came up with a long time ago, which is an even more extreme version, is an asteroid is heading for Earth. If it impacts Earth, it will destroy all life on Earth. By some bizarre science fiction set of circumstances, it is possible to stop the asteroid, or to divert the asteroid, but doing so will require the use of something which only is worth a nickel, but which belongs to a curmudgeon who has often said that he doesn't give a damn about whether Earth survives or whether he survives or anything else, and he doesn't want anybody else to use his device. So do you steal his device, violate his property rights, and stop the asteroid from destroying everything? Now, you can't claim that doing that really respects rights, because after all, people have a right not to be killed by asteroids, because the asteroid is not a person. You don't have a right not to be killed by lightning. All right? You don't have a right not to have a meteor fall on your head. You only have a right not to have other people kill you, and the asteroid is not another person. So all of these cases basically involve a trade-off between respecting rights and something else, generally human life, which is also important. And I think the better argument is to say that do not initiate coercion is a good rule of thumb. It allows transactions that benefit both parties to happen, and many transactions that benefit one party a lot and cost another a little can be arranged through bargaining, but not always, for reasons that I will be saying in a few minutes. There are situations where you can't do it by bargaining, and yet where there is a trade-off between a very small violation of rights and a very large cost in human life or other things that matter. And since respecting rights, although valuable, is not infinitely valuable, you therefore should, under some circumstances, violate them. I think my view, at least, is that do not initiate coercion is not only a good rule of thumb, it's also a legitimate moral rule, that all else being equal, compelling people is bad, but there are other bad things in the world, and therefore a little coercion to avoid a lot of other bad things might be the right choice, as in my examples. So that's my first example of the argument that we shouldn't make. Second one is the idea that property rights are simple and they are sufficient to solve most of the world's problems. So people think in terms of, it's my land, so I get to make the rules, and the basic rule is I can do anything on my land, and you cannot do anything that affects my land. When you turn on a light in your bedroom, I can see it from my land. That means that photons you have generated are trespassing, are affecting my eyes on my land. Do you need my permission to turn on your light? You dig a large hole at the edge of your land. All of the hole is on your land. However, it just happens that my house is on my land right next to your land, and it slides into your hole. You didn't put it into your hole. It's the law of gravity that did it. Which one of us has violated the other's rights? Did I violate your rights when my house trespassed on your land, or did you violate my rights when you caused my house to slide in? All right. One way of getting around this problem that people try to do is to say only a violation that does harm counts. And therefore, since turning on the light, those photons do no injury. I should say the question for any legal people here, the issue of the house sliding into the hole is a real common law issue. It's called the right of lateral support. In Pennsylvania, which is a U.S. state made mostly out of coal, it used to be the case that there were 3 different property rights, separable, associated with one piece of land. There was the surface right, which is what we usually think of the right to land, the right to do things on the surface. There was the mineral right, which was the right to dig coal or anything else from underneath the surface. And there was the support right, which was the right, if you owned the surface right, to have your surface stay where it was instead of having somebody dig a hole under it, which resulted in your surface collapsing into his hole. So if you were mining coal and you had the mineral rights but not the support rights, you had to leave enough coal to support the surface. That's a nice example of the fact that property rights in the real world are actually more common than in libertarians' imaginations. So go back to the idea that you solve these problems by only saying the only violation that does harm counts, but then does harm as judged by whom? That if the rule is that it is by a court that assesses damages, that means that when I do something that you claim damages, I'm making a forced sale of your rights. So it's a sort of a private version of eminent domain, which libertarians usually don't like. A related claim is that libertarians like to claim that no external agent can judge or decide my values for me. And that leads to other problems, which you can work out for yourself if you think about how tort law works, because it depends on somebody else judging how much injury was done to somebody. But I will pass over that for today. The right way to think about it, as law and econ people realize, is that nobody owns land. What you own is a bundle of rights with regard to the land, and it is not immediately clear a priori what belongs in the bundle. For example, should the ownership of land include the right to forbid trespass? How about harmless trespass? How about if I own a big forest and people like to walk across the forest in order not to go around it when they're going somewhere? It's not clear whether the rights should or not be included. And whether they are historically depends on the country and the time. I'm told that it at least used to be the case, maybe it still is, that in Italy, you had the right to prohibit trespass only close to your own dwelling. The right to lateral support. Do I have the right to have your property remain in a condition that affects my property in the same way it used to? In this case, that you haven't dug a hole that results in my stuff. How about the right not to have my building shade your swimming pool? Real case from Florida. 2 hotels, I think. And a more recent case, actually, from California, where the question was, my trees shading your solar panels. All right. Should the right, not at all obvious. How about the right not to have my building keep your chimney from drawing? That's an English, I think, 19th century common law case where the issue was you have two houses next to each other, buildings, they're not houses, next to each other. Somebody extends, I think, puts stuff on top, somehow extends the height of his building. The result is that the air that was blowing across the other building is now blocked. And the result is that the owner of the other building finds that his building is full of smoke because the chimney doesn't draw anymore. Is that a tort? Should he be able to enjoin it? So the basic problem is that some rights relate to two different properties, are of value to the owners of two different properties, and it's not immediately obvious how you define things in such a way that can solve that. I should say Ronald Coase, I think, did the closest that anybody has done to suggesting how you would in principle solve that. And if you're curious enough, I spend 2 chapters of my book, Law's Order, trying to explain that set of ideas. Next one you shouldn't claim is that laissez-faire solves everything. The simple argument for laissez-faire is individuals are rational, therefore each individual makes the right choice for himself. If you add that up, you get the right choice for everybody, so there's never a good reason for government to interfere. And the reason it's wrong is what economists call market failure. Like most technical terms, it doesn't mean what it says. Market failure is a particular form of failure which occurs in lots of places other than markets, but not all failure on markets are market failure, and lots of typical examples of market failure have nothing to do with markets. My standard example when I'm giving a talk about market failure is to say it's 1,000 years ago, you're one of 10,000 men with spears, you're in a line and your spears are pointing that way because coming at you are another 10,000 men, only they're on horseback with spears. And you do a very quick cost-benefit calculation, and you say, if all of us stand and keep our spears planted, with luck we can break their charge, and some of us will die, but many of us will live. If we run, horses run faster than we do. I should stand. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I said we. I don't control him and him. If everybody else stands and I run, one person running out of 10,000 will have very little effect on whether or not we stop the charge, and I won't be one of the ones killed. If everybody else runs and I stand, I'm dead. Whatever everybody else is doing, it's in my interest to run. So everybody runs and most of us dies. Welcome to the dark side of rationality. What's going on in these cases, and I can give you other and less exotic cases, some of which you have experienced yourself, such as noisy restaurants, where everybody raises his voice in order to be heard, and the result is that nobody can be heard. What's going on is that you are making a choice where some of the cost is going to other people. You also have the same problem if some of the benefit goes to other people, but I don't need to cover that. But if I'm doing a choice where some of the cost goes to other people, it is possible that the benefit to me is larger than the cost to me, but the benefit to me is smaller than the cost to me plus the other people affected. Everybody is doing that. So the result is that each of us is better off by his action, worse off by everybody else's action, and can well be that everybody's on net worse off, as in the case of my army running away. All right? That's market failure. I like to define market failure as a situation where individual rationality does not produce group rationality. And there is no reason why that can't happen on a market, and it can. Standard economic examples are externalities and public goods. Sometimes there are ingenious solutions to those problems. My standard example is the fact that a radio broadcast is a pure public good. It's obvious it can't be produced privately, and yet some clever person thought up the idea of producing not one public good but two. One public good with a positive cost of production and a positive value to the consumer. A second public good with a negative cost of production and possibly negative value to the consumer. Tie them tightly together and give away the package. And we call this a radio broadcast with advertisements on it. An advertisement has a negative cost of production because somebody will pay you to put it on. So that's one example. And there are other examples where you can think of clever ways that a private individual can, in fact, solve a market failure. I like to say that one of the things a market failure is a profit opportunity, because if you could only change what the group of people are doing, there would be a net benefit, and with luck, you could pocket some of it. But there is no guarantee in economic theory that you will always be able to do that. And therefore, there will, in fact, be situations where if everybody acts in his own rational interest, we are worse off than if everybody had done something else. And that's basically the economist's case for a government, that a sufficiently wise and benevolent ruler could keep us from doing things that on net harm us, get us to do things that on net benefit us, where the benefit goes to somebody else. Examples are pretty obvious: require vaccination against contagious diseases, subsidize basic research, regulate air pollution, and so forth. And that's why most economists are not anarchists or even hardcore libertarians. There is, however, a striking shortage of wise, benevolent, and all-powerful rulers. There is no particular reason to expect them to be who ends up in charge of things. That the right way to think of government is not as a benevolent dictator, but as a market. It's a political marketplace in which, just as on the ordinary market, each individual is acting in his own self-interest. The problem is that if you think about the logic of political action, almost all of it involves people taking actions where they aren't receiving the benefit or paying the cost. That a voter who goes to a great deal of trouble to figure out who is the best candidate and then votes for him is very slightly increasing the probability of the better person getting elected, in which case he's providing a benefit for all of the members of his polity. He's getting, 1/330 millionth of it in the U.S., which is that being the U.S. population. A judge who sets a bad precedent might perhaps, if it's a really bad precedent, reduce the GNP of the country by 1/100%. If you work it out, that is an enormous amount of damage for one human being to know, but he'll never know. It's not a cost to him. I like to point out a particular case where a body of judges made a mistake that a smart high school student should have been ashamed of making, and it almost certainly killed hundreds of people. This had to do with vaccination, actually. This was a case in which they found the producer of a vaccine liable for not doing enough warning of the fact that the vaccine had a very small probability of giving you polio. This was the old live polio vaccine before the later, better polio vaccine. The court agreed that this was a necessarily dangerous product. So it was not that there was anything wrong with producing the product, but they said that the company should have taken greater precautions to make sure that people knew this warning this risk was there. And the court argued that whether the company was obliged to do so depended on whether there was a significant chance that somebody would decide not to get vaccinated when they had the information. So they compared the risk of dying in 1 year from polio with the risk of of getting polio from the vaccination. However, getting vaccinated saves you for a lifetime risk of getting polio. So they were making a mistake of about a factor of 70. On their calculations, the two numbers were about equal, which meant that on the correct calculation, there was no question at all, but you should get vaccinated under those circumstances, hence the opposite result. That changed liability rule made companies much less willing to produce vaccines because they were afraid of being sued for a lot of money. Eventually, Congress, in effect, changed the rule by legislation. But for some period of time, there were fewer vaccines. I have no way of counting the bodies, but having fewer vaccines means more people die. In any case, my general point is that on the political market, the normal situation is one in which people are taking an action where they don't bear the costs or often don't get only part of the benefit. In the economic market, the normal transaction is one in which you bear the costs and get the benefit. That if you want to produce something, you've got to pay the workers enough so they'd rather work for you than doing anything else. You've got to pay the people you buy your inputs from enough so they're willing to sell them to you. So you are transferring all of the costs that are imposed by using their labor or their inputs to yourself in the price you're paying. You then transfer the benefit to yourself when you sell your output. So the normal situation on the market is one in which individuals do bear the net cost of their actions, which means that individual rationality does produce group rationality. There are special circumstances that I've just listed where it doesn't, but that means that market failure is the exception on the private market and the rule on the political market. And that seems to me a much better argument for saying you shouldn't transfer decisions from the private market to the political market than pretending that market failure doesn't exist and that the private market is perfect. Let me say a little bit about climate change, which is a subject that I actually gave a talk about yesterday in Czechia, and something I've been interested in for quite a while. The bad argument is that it isn't happening. The exact amount is uncertain because climate is a very complicated subject, but both ground stations and satellites show some level of warming, and nobody, as far as I can tell, has succeeded in explaining it all away, though people have tried. The next claim is, well, it's happening, but it's not our fault. And again, climate is very complicated, exact attribution is hard, but we do know that the CO2 concentration of the atmosphere has gone up by quite a lot. The physics are very simple of it. I should say most people who think they understand it have it wrong. Most people imagine that CO2 is an insulator. If CO2 were an insulator, it would be stopping the incoming heat from the sun as well as the outgoing heat from the Earth. The black body temperature of the Earth is in fact considerably lower than its present temperature, not higher. The critical thing about greenhouse gases is they are selectively transparent, that CO2 and water vapor are more transparent to the shortwave wavelength light coming down from the sun than to the long wavelength light coming up from the Earth, and therefore when there's more of it, you end up getting warming, which is what seems to have happened. And I should say that the question of whose fault it is doesn't matter very much. It's relevant for how you deal with it. But suppose you concluded that climate change was due to natural changes, but was having terrible effects. You would then want to try to figure out if there's some way of intervening to make it stop happening, even if it's not your fault. The right argument is that if a ton of CO2 causes a net cost of $1,000, then standard economics implies that you would like to have a carbon tax of $1,000 a ton. But in order to do that, you have to know what the external cost is, and nobody does. That the fact that largely gets ignored in the discussion is that warming has both positive and negative externalities. I would say that walking around London today, I would much rather it had been 5 or 10 degrees warmer. That it is true that more people die in hot summers, but fewer die in cold winters. If you look at a map, if you look at a chart of mortality by month for the US, what you observe is that it is high in winter and low in summer, which suggests that heat is on net reducing mortality, not producing it. Furthermore, it is true that warming will result in sea level rise, but if you actually read the IPCC reports instead of the news stories, you discover there's a tiny amount of sea level rise, that roughly speaking, it looks as though by the end of the century, sea level will be up by about 0.5 meters. Might be a bit more, but it's not going to be a lot more than that. The rule for the east coast of the US that I came across in a book that somebody had written in some other context is that a foot of sea level rise pushes the coastline in by 100 feet. So we are talking about, by the end of the century, the east coast of the US might be as much as 50 meters farther west than it now is. And if you think about a map, that's a trivial change. It's going to be inconvenient for somebody who happens to have a house right next to the coast, but that's about it. It's going to be more in some places, less in others. That's an order of magnitude kind of point, but it's actually a very small effect. On the other hand, if you look at a world map that shows average temperatures and a world map that shows population density, you discover that heat does not make places unlivable. That in fact, there are places which are among the hottest places in the world, which also have unusually high population density. The Philippine Islands is one example such. On the other hand, cold does keep people from living there. That the areas that are empty are mostly areas near the pole that are very cold. What happens with warming? Well, one of the interesting features of warming that nobody talks about is that the pattern is biased in our favor. That warming due to greenhouse gases is greater in cold places than in hot places. And the reason goes back, at least one reason, goes back to the fact that water vapor is a greenhouse gas. The warmer it is, the more water vapor is in the air. The more water vapor, the more of one greenhouse gas is in the air, the less the effect of adding another. So, in fact, if you look at the IPCC reports, they have maps showing their projections of temperature. And what do they show? They show a large increase near the poles, a smaller increase at the equator. So there is some temperature, some average temperature below which people don't live. You can draw a temperature contour. You can say, where is the boundary between just barely warm enough to live and not quite warm enough to live? You can then say, all right, if you have a certain amount of global warming, how much does that contour move? Well, I did the calculation. It's one of my Substack posts. And roughly speaking, on the IPCC projections, the warming by the end of the century will increase the usable land area of the Earth by about the area of the United States. So it's a fairly large effect. Now, you might, if you're being critical and thinking about it, say, yes, but that's extra land that's barely usable because it's land that's just barely warm enough. That's true. But just south of that, there's some land that used to be just barely warm enough and is now a bit better than that. And just south of that. So if you think about it, the right way of thinking about it is to collapse all of that and say the effect is that you're increasing the amount of good land, at least temperature good land, by about the amount by which the contour has moved to the pole. I should say you don't get anything out of the South Pole because Antarctica is cold enough that we're not going to be living on it even if it gets a little warmer. But you do get sizable increases in the North Pole. I'd like to also say that the only world leader who seems to be sensible on the subject of global warming is Vladimir Putin. He may say that he doesn't believe in global warming, but he can read a map. And Russia is going to have quite a lot more useful land if the temperature of the globe goes up. He's also pumping out all the fossil fuels he can. Not a nice man, but a sensible man. Furthermore, one of the other things that is very well established people don't talk about is the fact that CO2 is an input to photosynthesis. We've got massive experimental evidence on the effect of increasing CO2 concentration to plants' yield. In fact, people with greenhouses sometimes pump in CO2 for that purpose. There are two forms of photosynthesis that are common, called C3 and C4. Most crop plants are C3. The major exception is maize, which is C4. Doubling the CO2 concentration of the atmosphere increases the yield of C3 plants by about 20%. Doubling is roughly what the IPCC projects for the end of the century. So getting 20% more wheat, 20% more rice, 20% more of lots of other things is a big gain. C4 crops, you have little effect of increased yield, if any. However, both C3 and C4, increasing CO2 reduces the need for water. And the reason for that is very straightforward, that plants need carbon in order to make fruit and seeds and leaves and everything else. That plants are basically built out of carbon. They get carbon by passing atmosphere through the leaves. The higher the CO2 concentration, the less the amount of atmosphere they have to pass through the leaves to get a given amount of carbon. And the less air they pass through their leaves, the less water they lose by evaporation. So it turns out that if maize has plenty of water, you don't get much benefit from extra CO2. If it is water stressed, if it's short of water, you do get a benefit from CO2. So that's not only a benefit, it is in a certain sense the most certain consequence of adding CO2 to the air. That everything else, you've got a set of causal links. You add CO2 to the air, it makes things warmer. We don't know exactly how much warmer, complicated system. It makes things warmer. That means that sea level goes up. Well, that's a pretty natural result, but exactly how much, that's complicated. But adding CO2 is the very first step in the process, and that's what gives you your increased yield. So my basic point is that we not only don't know the size of the externality from producing CO2, we don't even know its sign. We don't know whether it makes us better or worse off on net. Furthermore, the effects you're talking about are spread over a long and very uncertain future, which means that we really can't know. There is an article published in Nature, which I've written a very detailed critique of, which you can find among my Substack posts, which claims to estimate the cost of an extra ton of CO2 for the next 3 centuries. And if you think about it, you should realize that anybody who writes such an article is a fraud. That is to say, there is no way of knowing. And as one example of that, about half of the cost they have is increased mortality due to warming, due to temperature. It is very uncertain that that's true at all. That it's there's a whole literature on this, which I've also commented on. It's complicated. But the critical point to see is that they are getting their numbers from mortality effects in the past, that whether people die of something depends on how good medicine is. And they are implicitly assuming that there will be no progress in medicine for the next 300 years. They never say that, but that's the implication of how they're analyzing the problem. So the CO2 output depends on future technology, and the cost of effects such as that one depend on lots and lots of different things. Furthermore, the climate science itself is pretty uncertain. It is not clear if hurricanes increase drought or not. It is not clear if hurricanes get worse or not. The actual, if you read the IPCC, if you read only the summary for policymakers, you will be told that tropical cyclones, which is what hurricanes are, that the ratio of high end to low end is going to increase. This is a correct statement about their projection. What they don't tell you is that the reason it's going to increase is because the number of low-end cyclones is going to go down. You have to read the actual report, not the summary for policymakers, to discover that. Now, I should say, the report also says that the high-end ones are going to get a little stronger. So that's a respect in which there really is a negative effect. But it also says that roughly the number of category 4 and 5 is going to stay about the same, and the number of categories 1 through 3 is going to go down. Projection, that is. So basically, my basic point is that an uncertain positive plus an uncertain negative could add up to a positive or negative sum that we don't know if we should tax carbon or subsidize it. How do you get the answer you want? If you want to restrict CO2 output, then you accept high estimates for climate sensitivity, for how much effect you get from CO2. You make generous estimates for possible negative effects, such as trying to claim that you can add up costs for 300 years without paying any attention to technological change. You make conservative estimates for the positive effects. You ignore some of the positive effects because you aren't looking for them. And you then conclude that science proves we should restrict CO2. If you want to reverse, if you don't want to do that, you could have the reverse policy and conclude that science tells us we should increase CO2. Further point is that even if it's true that increasing CO2 is a bad thing, there is a very serious public good problem in how you stop it, because any cost I bear benefits mostly other people. Any cost my country bears benefits mostly other people. So that what's actually happening with regard to CO2 is a religious movement, not a scientific movement. That it's not that the people of Canada say, or people of California, they're both equally guilty, say it is in our interest that we should reduce the CO2 output. Because it obviously isn't. First, Canada will be better off with warming. If you think about Canada as a very thin slice of usable land along the US border, and that slice was going to get something like twice as wide. But even if it were true, even California or Canada is contributing a tiny fraction, maybe 1% or 1,000% of the total CO2, so it doesn't make any sense for them to restrict it. And you end up with sort of crazy things because people say, well, you've got to protect the Earth. Our Mother Earth needs to be protected. So this follows that there probably isn't any plausible mechanism by which you're going to get the right policies for controlling CO2, even if CO2 is bad. On the other hand, adaptation to climate change is more nearly a private good. That a farmer who changes his crop variety because the temperatures have gone up is getting the benefit of doing so. A city that dikes against sea level rise, while it's a public good from the standpoint of the individual citizens, it's a private good from the standpoint of the city government. So you have a mechanism that doesn't require getting all of the governments of the world to cooperate, just one acting in his own interest. We are much better at producing private goods than public goods, and that's an argument for a strategy of adaptation rather than prevention. Furthermore, since warming produces good and bad effects, adaptation without prevention has the virtue that you get to collect the good effects while at least reducing the bad effects. All right, for my last one of my list, this may have gone too long, is the claim that anarchy is always better. And there are, in fact, at least two reasons why anarcho-capitalism might not work. One of them is conquest by a foreign state, and the other is reinvention of government by the rights enforcement agencies, alias cartelization. And I discuss this in some length, in more length in the third edition of Machinery of Freedom than in the first edition. But basically, defense against nations is a public good. We are not good at producing public goods. There are imperfect ways of doing it which might be sufficient, but whether they are sufficient is going to depend on how powerful and aggressive your neighbors are, how patriotic your population is, a bunch of variables that there's no way of guaranteeing will come up right. So therefore, almost certainly, under some circumstances, the anarcho-capitalist society would fall. The other problem is if there are only a few rights enforcement agencies, they might decide that robbery is more profitable than business and reinvent government. Simplest way is to say, we won't accept your customers, you won't accept our customers, now we're both monopolies over our existing customers. A better argument, in my view, is that market anarchy will work in some environments, in environments where external threats are weak enough and imperfect solutions to defense strong enough so it probably won't be conquered, and where the market for rights protection is large enough and economies of scale go small enough that you end up with many rights enforcement agencies, and that where it works, it will be better than any alternative. And you can see in Machinery of Freedom, I go through that in some detail, in particular that under anarcho-capitalism, you have law being produced on the market, and that market forces are going to tend to give you good law, which you don't get by political mechanisms. In general, sort of summarizing the argument that I'm making, let me say in defense of modest arguments, not violating rights is important but not infinitely important. Property rights are a useful technology but a complicated one. Laissez-faire is not perfect but the alternatives are worse. Climate change is real, very largely anthropogenic, but there is no good reason to think it is catastrophic, and it might turn out to be on net good. Why we shouldn't make bad arguments. First, because we value honesty for its own sake. That libertarians like to say that rights are violated by force or by fraud, and dishonest arguments are fraud. Second, bad arguments drive away smart people because they're the ones who see through them, and you don't really want to have a movement that's only stupid people. This is sort of related to the general issue of how do you change the world, that one Ayn Rand, or for that matter, one team who make Yes Minister, are worth 1,000 hired workers. That is to say, very talented people who successfully put their ideas in a form that will spread, that will convince people, are an enormously valuable resource for any movement. And you're going to lose them if you insist on making bad arguments. My site is www.daviddfriedman.com, so it's pretty easy to find. You can find on it a free PDF of the current edition of Machinery of Freedom, my Substack posts sorted by topic, a search bar where you can find out what I said on any subject, which searches all of my blogs, all of my Substack posts, and most of my published writing. Full text of most of my books, recordings of a whole bunch of my talks if you find my talks interesting, and you may find my Substack interesting. I bring it out every 3 days. And I think the one I'm bringing out tomorrow is probably going to be, does climate catastrophe pass the giggle test? I've got several ready. Thank you. Sure.
David. Questions? Bob?
Hi. So suppose that anarchism works and thus produces laws that maximize economic efficiency.
Yes.
Even if these laws tend to be mostly libertarian, you can see that in some cases they might not be. For example,
Correct.
If enough people despise kidney sales, the law that emerges might be to prohibit kidney transactions.
Yes.
Why then still defend anarchism instead of directly advocating for libertarian policies in the hope of persuading enough people such that it becomes profitable for politicians to legislate them? And now a joke, isn't defending anarchism a bad argument that libertarians shouldn't make? Thanks, I'm a big fan.
Yeah. There is no reason why you should not try to persuade people of good ideas, but as far as I can tell, the circumstances under which anarcho-capitalism will produce bad non-libertarian laws are also circumstances under which the alternatives will produce non-libertarian laws. So I don't think that's an argument against anarchism. It's an argument against claiming that anarchism is necessarily libertarian. That the claim I make is that it will tend to be libertarian, And I should say, you don't even need, well, I guess that's enough. Other questions?
One question. So, talking about climate change, one of the things I've noticed is like quite non-trivial in being involved in politics or being involved in academia is that they're very different worlds. There's like men of affairs, men and women of affairs, and there's also men of academia and intellectualism, and they just work in completely different ways. So I found like you're in a horror if you turn to a political group and try to use intellectual arguments it doesn't work very well. You need to be a consensus builder, and it's like it's quite non-trivial basically. It's very hard when you're trying to convince a group to act against a threat like climate change to use arguments to change their mind. You have to use consensus building, and so this is a problem with climate change, is that no amount of scientific argument ever really makes a difference. However high level your understanding of climate science is, it doesn't lead to a better consensus building. So maybe there isn't.
I don't understand what you mean by consensus building. There's one way of building consensus is to give people arguments, but that's not what you're talking about.
You give an example of people standing in a line.
Yeah.
They all stick together, they survive. But how do you convince them all to stand in a line together? You have to convince your neighbours to some extent, but shouting arguments.
No, the way you do it is to march your army across a river, burn the bridge behind you, and then there's no place for people to run, and so we'll have to stand. This is an old technology.
Cortez burned his ships when he went to the New World. Yes, motivated people, exactly. But the thing is, it's like maybe all the money we pour into climate change will be ineffective, because even if we try our absolute best to convince everyone by pouring a huge amount of money into climate change, it never builds the consensus we need. And halfway down the line, everything stops. So that there isn't the utopia of a world which is fighting against climate change. It's a great dream, which may be highly motivated, but it's impossible to build a consensus in that way. People will always eventually reach the limit of where they're willing to agree with each other to make sacrifices personally for a future in 1,000 years. It's just not humans can't.
But of course, the people who are pushing climate change keep insisting it's going to be terrible in 15 years.
Exactly, that's right. But maybe people just don't.
Applies to every single topic.
It applies to long-term topics, and long-term topics you can't defend yourself against the long-term in that way. There's a problem with Brexit. I mean, not a problem with Brexit. The problem with arguing in favour or against Brexit is it's just the economic catastrophe is too difficult to demonstrate. It's so long-term. Convincing people today to accept immigration because economic advantage will come. It doesn't. People don't agree. They're worried about today. They're worried about what happens tomorrow when they see an immigrant. If you see what I mean. And I wish I had a brilliant argument in favour which could make everyone point in the same direction of climate change, but it almost feels futile. And you see that's my.
What do you think about that, David?
What do I think about it? I think that one of the Substack posts that I have ready but have not will put up at some point is on how to change the world, and which is in a sense what you're talking about. One of the ways is by creating memes, by putting your ideas in a form that people will find entertaining and want to repeat. And my only example of doing that is I wrote something a long time ago in which what I said essentially was, this is with regard to foreign trade, that there are two technologies for making automobiles. You can build them in Detroit or you can grow them in Iowa. And the way you grow automobiles in Iowa is that you grow the raw material they're made out of, which is called wheat. You put it on a ship. You send the ship into the Pacific, and it comes back with Hondas on it. And that from your standpoint, there might as well be a machine sitting out in the Pacific where you pour wheat in and automobiles come out. And that therefore, the trade is the technology for production. And that when you say you are protecting American auto workers from Japanese auto workers, you're wrong. You're protecting American auto workers from the competition of American farmers. That's a way of making the argument which people find entertaining, which is easy to repeat. If you Google growing Hondas online, you can find a bunch of people who repeat it. But that's one example of one of the tactics for doing what you're saying, which is to change the mix of free information that people act on and therefore get them to act differently. But a different point, which you may also be making, is that human beings are very tribal, and that you see a whole lot of behavior which makes no sense from a rational standpoint, but which consists of saying, my allies say X, therefore I should say X. My enemies say Y, therefore I should say not Y. And that, unfortunately, is a very common element in human behavior. Another question?
I just have a small one, again on climate change, sorry. You said a lot of positive arguments about how climate change can be positive and negative, but we don't want to have a runoff effect, like we don't want to become like Venus, but if we assume that climate change is a negative externalities in the future, would you say that carbon markets are the perfect or most efficient solutions for decreasing our carbon output in the world, both voluntary and compliance carbon markets?
If you had a world government that could impose a carbon tax, that would be a sensible way of reducing CO2. With regard to the idea of runaway, of turning it into Venus or whatever, most people don't realize that at the moment it's pretty cold. That if you actually look at a graph, not through the last few thousand years, but through the last 150 million years, through geological time, it turns out that we're at the low end, not at the high end of temperature. So that makes it very unlikely that getting a little bit warmer will set off any catastrophic effects. The highest temperature of the last roughly 100 million years is roughly 13 degrees centigrade above our present temperature. Yeah.
I think we ought to be steer clear of accepting market failure too often. Sometimes people will label things market failure and they're not. And so we're in danger of fighting on their territory if we accept loads of things are market failure. Or externalities. Alex Epstein says that there often isn't such a thing as externalities, and most of the time when people say
There is such a thing as externalities, but people...
He says that a lot of the time when you look into it, there is a civil law way of getting around. We can attribute rights to people, and there is a better way of doing
Sometimes.
it instead of calling them. And there's an excellent film which sort of illustrates this point, where there's a pollution of a river, and it's causing a lot of disease in. It's caused by DuPont, the paint manufacturers. And it's poisoning a lot of people in the town, and they've got the EPA, but the EPA has no no strength, no muscle, because it's a regulator that's already captured by the paint manufacturers. So years and years of the EPA being supposedly looking after the externality of pollution in a river hasn't worked. So that approach hasn't worked. But in the end, what works is a group of people and some committed lawyers getting together, getting a class action and suing DuPont under civil law, and that's a very good example of what something that looks like an externality on the surface.
No, it is an externality. Tort law is the way that the common law is a way that the common law tries to deal with externalities.
As a reason for saying that's why we need government. We need government. Whenever there's an externality, we need government. We don't always.
I'd say one thing that it's been missing in libertarian conversations, and it kind of piggybacks on this gentleman's point, which was people are not able to look far into the future. There's nothing uniting them behind something, and I believe that there is a role there with regards to values and with regards to something that is outside of us as humans, something that's everlasting, let's say, like God in the time of Adam Smith would unite the entire nation under a similar set of beliefs at least, and we would collaborate towards that with that in mind. So my question is more maybe esoteric, and what's the role of values, culture, and perhaps unification around God as a personal being or as a concept?
Yeah, but of course, Adam Smith was against unification around God. That was Hume's position. Yes. Hume argued in favor of a established religion, and Smith argued against established religion because he thought that if you had competing religious groups, that would make people behave better.
For Christianity can exist as an establishment and as a
Yeah.
libertarian.
But anyway, I guess I would only say I don't think I have very much to say on that, on the subject that you're raising, that clearly values affect things. I don't know of any very good way of changing what values are, and I'm not at all sure that I know how different values are related to different outcomes.
Last question over here.
Cheers. You gave us some arguments on topics where we often shouldn't go, and some different ways to phrase it. But are there any that you would lead with, or are there any of your favourite arguments for free market or libertarianism that you would?
Yeah, I think the one that I just gave on market failure, the argument that market failure is the exception on the private market and the rule on the public market. That would be one of the ones that I am fond of making, because market failure is one of the standard things that people talk about as reasons why you need government, and I'm arguing that it's a reason why you don't need government, or rather why government is worse than the alternatives. So that would be certainly one of my favorite arguments. There's a certain sense in which the major argument, if it's an argument, is the possibility of decentralized coordination. That the reason why economists as a group are more libertarian than academics as a group, certainly than social scientists as a group, is that the strongest argument against our position is not understanding how it's possible to have coordination without somebody coordinating. And anybody who doesn't understand how that's possible is not an economist. Whether or not they think, that it does an adequate job, the way in which the price system results in combining information and preferences of large numbers of people into a single outcome is something you have to understand in order to do economics. And you can go on for that and say, well, there are ways of tweaking it to make it better. But anyway, so I would say that there's a certain sense in which the main thing is teaching people economics, but that's hard.
Thank you very much, everyone. Just want to give a round of applause today.